The Space Marines of the Adeptus Astartes are the Imperium's finest warriors. In this video we're going to show you exactly how to paint your Space Marines as noble and courageous Ultramarines up to battle ready standard so you can get them on the table in no time at all. Now we're going to show you three different models in this video. First a Primaris Intercessor, then a Primaris Redempted Dreadnought, and then finally a Primaris Impulsor. We can use different techniques on these three different models so you can see how to paint your miniatures for your force. First of all, let's have a look at that Primaris Intercessor. Now we've undercoated all of our models here with Crag Blue spray, which really helps speed up the process as that's the main armour of the Ultramarines. We're going to apply some base coats first, and the first base coat we're going to apply is Corvus Black, which we're going to put into the joints in between our Space Marines armour. Grab your medium layer brush for this, and let's get started. Let's take some Corvus Black from the pot and apply it here to our palette. Now base paint like this is often quite thick, so to help thin it down and avoid lumps on the miniature, we're going to add some water from our pot here and thin it down on the palette like this. Perfect. Then load our brush up, make sure it's got a nice point on it, and onto our Space Marine. Here we're applying the Corvus Black on the joints in between our Space Marine's armour, so you can see here the joints in between the arms like this. Also if we spin the miniature around, we've got the joints on the back too, here on the thighs and the knees. Just make sure you're getting all those joints on the armour. Now, try and be as neat as you possibly can, but don't worry if you make a mistake. We have a pot of Crag Blue paint on hand. We can always go over any mistakes we make. So there we go, that's the Corvus Black applied onto the joints in our Space Marines armour. That's our first base coat done, and we're off to a great start. Let's move on to our next base coat next. This will be lead Belcher, which we're going to apply onto the metal areas of the model, such as the bolt rifle and the vents on the backpack. Again, grab your medium layer brush for this one. Let's take some paint from the pot and apply it to our palette. Now, being a metallic paint, we're not going to add too much water here, just a little bit to help thin it down when it goes on the miniature. Load our brush up again, and then onto our Space Marine. Here, we're applying the metal onto the bolt rifle here at the back, the metal parts. We're also going to apply it onto the vents on the backpack here at the back, and any other metal parts you have on your miniature. Maybe you've got a combat blade or a grenade. Apply this lead Belcher all over those areas, and once that's done, we'll move on to the next stage. There we go, that's the lead Belcher applied onto the metal areas of our Space Marine. Right, up next we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to use a contrast paint, Basilicanum Grey, but we're going to use it in two different ways. First of all, we're going to use it to apply over the black and the metal areas we've just applied to help shade them down. Then we're going to very carefully apply it into the recesses on the blue armour to help shade that down too. First of all, it going onto the metal and black areas. For this, we're using our medium shade brush. Now with a contrast paint, we're going to take it out of the pot like so and apply it to our palette like this. We're not going to thin it down at all because contrast paints come pre-thinned, but we are going to make sure we're not overloading our brush with too much paint. Get a nice amount on your brush there, then onto our Space Marine. Here, we're applying this onto the metal and black we just painted on. A nice even coat all over those areas like this. What this will do will give a really cool shaded appearance and make that metal and grey look a bit more gritty. With that done, now we've got Basilicanum Grey again, but this time we've got a small layer brush and we're going to very carefully paint Basilicanum Grey into the recesses of the blue armour like this. Now you can see this is taking quite a while to do and we're trying to be as neat as we possibly can. It's really worth taking your time around the Space Marine to paint this in and be as neat as you possibly can. Don't worry if you do make a mistake, of course, you can always grab that pot of Crag Blue and tidy it up later on. So there we go, that's the shading done all over the blue armour. Just look at the difference that makes. Alright, up next let's have a look at our next area, and that's going to be the gun casing, which we're going to paint with Abaddon Black. Grab your medium layer brush for this one. Let's take some Abaddon Black from the pot and onto the palette here. Now again, as a base paint, we're going to take a little bit of water, mix it in to help thin it down when it goes onto the miniature. Load the brush up, and then onto our Ultramarine. Here we're painting the gun casing on the bolt rifle with Abaddon Black. Now, if your miniature has other casings as well, such as a chainsaw or other pistols, paint them in now the same colour. There we go, that's the weapon casing done. You can also see we've painted the wires coming out of our Space Marine's helmet black too. Let's add some gold onto our Ultramarine next, and for this we'll be painting the chest eagle or Aquila and the shoulder pad trim with Retributive Armor. Once that's done, we'll apply Rightland Fleshlight gloss shade over the top of it. First of all, that Retributive Armor, and for this, as it's small detail, we're painting with our small layer brush. Let's take some paint from the pot and onto our palette. Now here, Retributive Armor is a relatively thick paint, so we're going to add a little bit of water here to help thin it down before it goes on. There we go, perfect. Load your brush up, and then onto our Ultramarine. Here, we're painting the Aquila, or chest eagle here, at the front of the Space Marine, with Retributive Armor. We're also going to paint the shoulder pad trim around the edges of the shoulder pads here with the same colour. We're also going to paint the aquila, or the little eagle, on the front of the bolt rifle too. With that applied, we're applying Rightland Fleshlight Gloss Wash over the top. Now we're applying it quite liberally all over the gold areas like this. We're using our small layer brush to make sure we don't make too many mistakes. Apply a nice even layer all over, allow it to dry, and once it has, you'll see it's nice and shiny. There we go, that's our gold looking real shiny. Alright, up next let's paint the leather on our Space Marine. Now our Intercessor here has a belt around his waist, but if your model has pouches or a holster for your gun too, paint these at the same time. For this we'll start off with a base coat of Mournfang Brown, and over the top of that we'll add a wash of Agrax Earthshade. For this we're starting off with our small layer brush. Let's take some Mournfang Brown from the pot and onto our palette here. Now I'm going to thin it down just a touch, as always, just make sure it goes on real smooth. There we go, then onto our Marine. Here we're picking out the belt around his waist here, so this is the leather around here as well. Like I say, if you've got a pouch or a holster here, paint it at the same time. Over the top of this we're adding a shade of Agrax Earthshade, just apply it nice and evenly all over the leather. Here we're using a small layer brush again, just to make sure we don't make too many mistakes. And that's the Agrax Earthshade dry. Alright, the last thing to do on the Space Marine himself is to paint in the eyes, and for this we're going to use a special technical paint. We'll start off by base coating it with Corax White, and then we're going to use the technical paint Spirit Stone Red, which is a gemstone paint designed to give a sort of glassy look. First of all, that base coat of Corax White. For this again we're using our small layer brush, as this is tiny detail. Let's take some paint from the pot, not too much here, to make sure we've got a tiny amount in the brush. Add it to our palette here, a touch of water just to help thin it down, make sure it goes on real smooth. There we go, then onto the Space Marine. Here we're very carefully painting in the eyes of our Space Marine, so just brace your hand against the side of your painting handle like so. Just paint in the eyes like this with Corax White. With that done, we're very carefully painting some Spirit Stone Red technical paint into the eyes here to give that sort of glassy appearance of Space Marine lenses. And with the eyes painted, our Primaris Intercessor is done. Alright, let's paint something a little bit bigger now and move on to a Redempted Dreadnought. Now the techniques here are going to be very similar, but we are going to apply them in slightly different ways. First of all, we're going to be painting the metal part of our Dreadnought, as that's the messiest bit. We'll start with a base coat of lead Belcher, then as before we'll apply a contrast paint of Basilicana and Grey over the top, and then we'll dry brush it with Iron Hand Steel. We're doing this now to get the messy bit out of the way on the miniature so we can go back to tidy it up later on. First of all, that base coat of lead Belcher, and for this we've turned to our large base brush as it's such a big area. Let's take some paint from the pot and apply it to our palette here like so. We've got quite a bit here, so it's going to load our palette up. I'm going to thin it down with a touch of water, not too much, about a brushful there. Perfect. Then onto our Dreadnought. Here we're painting all the metal areas of our Dreadnought like this, so just poking in with our big brush and hitting those metal areas. Now naturally, using such a big brush and such a large area like this, we're going to hit other parts of the model that are going to be blue or black or other colours later on. Not a problem at all. The reason we're doing this first is so we can afford to be messy like this, so we can go and tidy those bits back up later on. If you're a bit concerned about which parts of the model are supposed to be metal and which parts aren't, have a really good look at the box cover or the pictures on the Games Workshop website, and that'll really help you out. So there we go, that's the lead Belcher applied. Look how messy we've been, but that's not a problem. We're going to go and touch that up later on. Up next, let's shade down that metal, and just like before, we're going to use a contrast paint here, Basilicanum Grey. As it's such a large area, we're going to our large shade brush for this one. Let's take some Basilicanum Grey from the pot and onto our palette here. Again, we're just making sure we're loading up our brush with just enough paint, not overloading it with too much. Bingo. Then onto our Dreadnought. Here, we're liberally applying the Basilicanum Grey all over the metal areas we've just painted. So literally a nice even coat all over those areas. Again here, you're going to hit areas of the model that aren't going to be metal later on. That's absolutely not a problem at all. We're going to go back later and correct those. So we go a nice even coat with this Basilicanum Grey over all the metal. There we go, the Basilicanum Grey has dry, giving this really cool look on the metal. Yeah, the rest of the model looks a bit messy right now, but we will be tidying that up later on. Up next, let's get even more messy by adding a dry brush of Iron Hand Steel over the top of that metal. Now you might be thinking it's a bit strange, why are we dry brushing this now in a battle ready video, but the reason is because we want to add this messy stage now, so we go back and tidy up the rest of the model later on. If you come to do this later, you won't mess up the rest of the miniature as you do it. So for this, grab your medium dry brush. Let's take some paint from the pot onto our palette here. Now we've got a bit of tissue paper on our palette here. As with a dry brush, we want to get rid of most of the paint onto the piece of tissue paper. So just brush off most of it like this. There we go, onto the tissue. Get rid of almost all of the paint. That's why it's called dry brushing. Then onto the miniature. What we're doing here is we're applying this dry brush lightly over the metal areas like this. You'll see as you do it that some of the areas are picked out. The raised bits will be picked out and they'll give a sort of natural highlight to the metal areas. Do this all over the metal bits. It's going to get even more messy on those blue bits, but don't worry, we are going to tidy those up later on. Once you've done this, we'll go back and pick out the next stage. So there we go, that's the messy dry brush done, and it's now time for the next stage. Not quite tidying up yet, we're going to add one more stage in before that tidy up. Here we're going to pick out some areas in black. That'll be the weapon casing and various parts of the Dreadnought's armour. Grab your medium layer brush for this and some Abaddon black. Let's take some black from the pot like so and onto our palette here. Now here we're going to be adding a little bit of water just to thin it down to make sure it goes on real smooth. Load your brush up like so. Then onto our Dreadnought. Here we're picking out some areas in black that we want to just to break up the metal areas like this. So for example the inner thighs here, like so. We're also going to pick out other parts on the Dreadnought here, like the housing of the power pack at the back here. I'm also going to pick out the weapon casing of the plasma cannon, or the onslaught cannon if you've got one in your Dreadnought, and the storm bolters on the front too. Take your time with this one, make sure as neat as you possibly can. Try not to hit the metal areas, but don't worry if you do, you can always go back and tidy those up. So there we go, the black's been applied onto the weapon casings and various parts of the armour too. Right, fans of neatness will be happy to know it's now time to tidy up that blue armour. So we're going to start off with a base coat of Macragge blue all over the armour to help tidy it up. Then once that's done, we've got a nice solid base coat, we're going to go back into the recesses with contrast paint Basilicanum Grey, just like we did with the Intercessor earlier on, to provide some shading. First of all, that base coat of Macragge blue. For this, we're turning to our medium base brush. Let's take some paint from the pot and onto our palette here. Now we're going to add a little bit of water here just to make sure our paint is nice and thin, so it goes on the model real smooth. Then onto our Dreadnought. Here we're going to be going over all of the blue areas to tidy them back up again. Make sure you're taking your time here to be nice and neat, so don't hit the black areas or the metal areas. Just make sure we're just painting the areas we want to be blue. You may find as well on some of the areas of the model that the metal and the Basilicanum Grey are so strong you may need a second coat. That's not a problem at all. Let the first coat dry and then apply a second coat to neaten up. Now we've tidied up with the Macragge blue, we're going back in with our Basilicanum Grey contrast paint and our small layer brush, and just painting it carefully into the recesses all over our Dreadnought. So anywhere where two blue armour panels join, just adding the small little recess shade of Basilicanum Grey. Take your time on this one again as before, in order to be as neat as you possibly can be. Work your way around the entire model. Once that's done, we'll move on to the next stage. That's the Basilicanum Grey applied all over the blue armour, and just look at the difference it makes. Alright, let's add some more details next, and up next it's the gold. Here we're going to be painting the chest aquila on the sarcophagus and other gold details. We'll start with a base coat of Retributive Armor, then it's a wash of Rightland Fleshlight gloss over the top. Grab your medium layer brush for this one. Let's take some Retributive Armor from the pot and onto our palette. Now as always, we're going to take a little bit of water just to thin it down. There we go, perfect. Then onto the Dreadnought. Here we're picking out the gold details on the miniature. So we've got the eagle on the front of the sarcophagus here. Going to be painting it in. I'm not going to paint the scroll with the gold, we're just going to paint the eagle at the back. We'll also paint the trim around the top here, like so. And also look out for other gold details on the model. For example, on the plasma cannon here, there's a little skull, we're going to pick that out too. With the base coat applied, next up we're applying a wash of Rightland Fleshlight gloss all over the gold. Here we're using our medium layer brush, and being quite liberal as well, but just make sure we don't hit the blue. There we go, that's our gold looking really shiny. Up next, let's paint some brass. This will be for the power cells under that huge plasma cannon and also the tip of the heavy flamer too. We're going to start off with a base coat of Runelord brass, and over the top of that we'll apply a wash of Cryptek Armor Shade gloss. First of all, that base coat of Runelord brass, and for this we're using our medium base brush. Let's grab some paint from the pot and onto our palette. And as always with a base paint, we're going to add a little bit of water to help thin it down. Makes it a little bit smoother when it goes on. Then onto our Dreadnought. Here, we're applying this onto the power cells underneath the plasma gun like this. Nice even coat under those power cells. Also, we're going to paint the heavy flamer barrel in this colour too. Once that's dry, we're applying a wash of Cryptek Armor Shade gloss all over those brass sections we've just painted. And that's the brass done. Right, next up, let's add some more details to our Dreadnought. Here we're going to be adding Corax White as a base coat onto various parts of the miniature, ready for us to paint them later on. This is going to be the missile tips, the cog mechanicus on his back, various lenses and things around the model, and also the headlight and the massive plasma coil on the gun too. For all of these, we're going to be using our medium layer brush. Let's take some Corax White from the pot and onto our palette. Now this paint's quite thick, so we're going to have quite a bit of water here from our pot, just to mix it into the palette, just to make sure it goes on real smooth. There we go, perfect. Then onto the model. Now I'm painting the plasma coil here to show you how that goes, but also make sure you're picking out the missile tips, the lenses, the headlight, and of course the cog mechanicus on his back as well. And we placed the Corax White on the model in the various places we wanted it to be. Let's start putting some paints over the top of it next. We'll start off with Apothecary White, which is going to go onto the missile tips and also the cog mechanicus on the back. Then we'll place Spirit Stone Red, as we did before, onto the lenses. Then we're going to use Ethematic Blue to pick out the plasma coils, and finally Black Templar to pick out the black parts of the cog mechanicus. First of all, that Apothecary White, and here we're using our medium layer brush. Let's grab some paint from the pot and onto our palette here. Now as a contrast paint, Apothecary White doesn't need thinning down, just making sure we're not overloading the brush with too much paint. Then onto our miniature. Here, we're just very lightly applying it onto the missile tips at the top here on the missile launcher. And we're also going to turn our model around and paint it all over the cog mechanicus on the back too. Next up, Spirit Stone Red is being used to paint all the lenses on the model, and also the targeting arrays as well, such as these ones on the front of the Stormbolters here. We've turned to our small layer brush here to make sure we've got nice control on the brush. Up next, we've got our medium layer brush, and we're applying a nice heavy coat of Ethematic Blue onto our plasma coils here. Now don't worry too much if you go over the edges here. If you do, it'll look like cool plasma glow going onto the weapon casing. Up next, we're painting the cog mechanicum here with Black Templar. Now what we're doing here is we're picking out the left of the skull like this with a small layer brush, just very carefully picking out the left hand side of the skull like that. Draw a line down the centre with the Black Templar. We're also going to paint the right hand side of the cog as well, like this. There we go, that's done. So let's look at the next detail on the miniature. This is going to be the spotlight or the headlight at the top of the Dreadnought. Now we've already base coated with Corax White, and up next we're going to apply a layer of Iron Yellow contrast paint before picking out the grills and the metal parts of the headlight with Iron Hand Steel. First of all, that Iron Yellow. For this, grab your small layer brush. Let's take some Iron Yellow from the pot and onto the palette. Again, we're making sure we've not got too much paint on the brush. There we go, perfect. Then onto our Dreadnought. Here we're applying a nice even coat all over the spotlight, just like so. You're absolutely going to hit the parts of the model that are metal, the grille over the front, not a problem. We're going to paint those in a second. Then again with our small layer brush, we're picking out the grille on the front of the headlight here with Iron Hand Steel. Really take your time here and be as neat as you possibly can. Don't hit the yellow parts if you can possibly avoid it. There we go, that's the headlight done. Alright, up next let's have a look at painting the purity seals and the parchment on our miniature. First of all, we'll start by painting the parchment of the purity seals and the other scroll work on the model with Rakarth Flesh. Then we'll apply contrast paint, Skeleton Horde over the top of that, before picking out the wax of the purity seals with Baraknar Burgundy. While we've got Baraknar Burgundy open, we're also going to paint a few wires around the model as well. First of all, that base coat of Rakarth Flesh. For this, these details are quite small, so we're using our small layer brush. Let's grab some paint from the pot and apply it to our palette like so. Now, here we're going to add a little bit of water just to make it thin down, so it goes on real smooth like all of our base paints. Then, onto the miniature. Here, we're picking out the parchment of the purity seal. So we've got a purity seal here, for example. We're going to just pick that out there. Also, any other parchment on the model we want to be painting at the same time. So this little scroll on the front of the sarcophagus, we'll pick that out right now too. Next up, we've grabbed our medium layer brush and we're applying a layer of Skeleton Horde contrast paint over the top of that base coat. Next up, we've got some Baraknar Burgundy, and we're picking out the wax on our purity seals. While we have this colour out, we're also going to paint various wires around the model too. Now, wires on your Dreadnought can be painted just about any colour you like. They look best in dark colours. So while we've got this colour out, we're going to pick a few out now. There we go, that's our Dreadnought done. Alright, up next let's have a look at painting a vehicle, and for this we've got a Primaris Impulsor ready to go. You'll notice we've already undercoated it with Macragge Blue spray, and we've not attached it to its base, and we've got a separate sub-assembly for the turret too. All of these things have been done to make painting really easy. Now we're going to start off similar to the Dreadnought here by painting the metal areas of the miniature. We'll start with a base coat of lead Belcher on the metal bits, then we'll coat that with a coat of Basilicana and Grey contrast paint. After that we'll dry brush it with Iron Hand Steel before going back with our Macragge Blue paint in a pot to tidy up all the blue areas. First of all, that base coat of lead Belcher, and for this we're using our large base brush. Let's grab some paint from the pot and apply it to our palette like so. Now again with the base paint we're going to be adding a little bit of water here just to help smooth it out, make it nice and thin, and then onto our Impulsor. Here we're picking out all the parts of the miniature that are going to be metal. So looking at the hover tracks here, the various guns, the aerials, lots of different parts around the miniature. If you need a good guide on what's going to be metal on the model, have a really good look at the picture on the Games Workshop website, on your codex, or on the front of the box, and that'll really help you out. Now naturally as you do this stage it's going to be quite messy, and you're going to hit parts of the model that aren't going to be silver later on. That's not a problem, we're going to go back and tidy those up later, so don't worry about being really messy here. Once that's applied, next up we're adding a layer of Basilicana and Grey contrast paint all over the metal areas. Here we're using a large wash brush to get it on nice and quick and evenly. Again, you're going to make a lot of mess doing this, but don't worry, we're going to go back later on and tidy that up. Then, as before, we're adding a dry brush of Iron Hand Steel over the top of the metallics here, getting the messy parts of the model out of the way. Okay, with those messy bits done, now it's time to go back with our Macragge Blue paint out of a pot and our medium base brush and just touch up the blue armour on our Impulsor. There we go, that's the blue done, and we're ready for the next stage. Up next, let's paint the rest of the armour on our tank. Now we're going to start off by shading into the recesses of the tank here, and we could use Basilicana and Grey as we did in the other sections of this video. But instead here we're going to use Agrat's Earthshade. It's a brown wash, and doing this will mean it looks a little bit more weathered and filthy as a tank might get covered in dirt. We're also going to apply this wash to the lower part of the tracks as well to make it look like dirt's flown up and hit them too. Once that's done, we're going to complete the blue armour by giving it a dry brush of Kronos Blue. We're doing this now to get the messy bits out of the way so we can paint the rest of the model neatly. After that, we're going to pick out areas of the model in black with Abaddon black, such as the gun casing and the various parts of the armour too. First of all, it's that Agrat's Earthshade, and for this we're using our medium shade brush. Let's take some paint from the pot like so and onto our palette. Here we're going to add a touch of water to thin it down so it's a bit more subtle when it applies onto the miniature. Make sure we've got a nice point on the shade brush, then onto the model. Here, we're applying Agrat's Earthshade into the recesses all over our tank, as we did before with the other miniatures. And don't worry too much if we make a mistake and go a bit over. This Agrat's Earthshade wash is going to be brown, and therefore may look like extra weathering and filth and dirt and crust on the tank if you make a bit of a mistake. We're going to go around the entire tank and add this to the recesses like so. We're also going to add a wash of Agrat's Earthshade onto the bottom of the tracks down here as well, to make it look like dirt has flung up and hit the tracks. With the wash applied in the recesses, now we're going to give it a quick dry brush of Kronos Blue using our medium dry brush. Here we're going to be using circular motions all over to make sure we're getting a nice even coverage of the dry brush. Next up we've got some Abaddon black, and we're picking out the black areas of the miniature, such as gun casings, extra bits of armour panels and the vision ports as well. If you're a bit confused about which parts of the model want to be black, have a really good look at the picture on the front of the box. So there we go, that's the black painted in. Alright, up next it's time to paint the gold on our model, and for this we're going to paint it the same way we painted the other two models in this video. Start with a base coat of Retributive Armor, and then we'll add a wash of Rightland Fleshlight gloss over the top. For both of these we're using our medium layer brush. Let's grab some Retributive Armor from the pot and add it to our palette here. Again, a touch of water just to thin it down, helps it go on real smooth onto the miniature. Then onto our Impulsor. Here we're painting it onto the Aquila at the front here, and any other gold details that we have around the miniature. There's going to be little symbols as well, such as these little skulls here, and the little Aquila on the top of the gun here as well, but have a really good look around the model, make sure we're picking out all the gold bits you want. Then, as before, it's a coat of Rightland Fleshlight gloss over the gold. Here we're painting it with a medium layer brush and applying it quite liberally. There we go, that's the gold looking nice and shiny. Up next, it's time to pick out the next few details on the miniature. Here we're going to be painting areas like the lenses, the headlights, the small screens in the crew compartment and the skull with Corax white. Then we'll paint the lenses with Spirit Stone red as before. We'll paint the headlights with Iron yellow before picking out the grills and headlights with Iron Hand steel. We'll paint the screens with Dark Angel's green contrast paint and the small skull on the inside with Skeleton Horde. For all of this we're going to be using our small layer brush as it's really small detail. First of all, that Corax white. Let's grab some paint from the pot and onto our palette like so. Again, a touch of water here to help thin it down as it's quite a thick paint to start with. There we go, load our brush up, then onto our miniature. Here we're picking out those areas we talked about with Corax white. So onto the small lenses, there's quite a few of these around the model, so make sure you get them all. We'll paint the headlights too, and inside the crew compartment at the back, there's the screens and the skull too. We're going to pick those out now too, and the headlights as well. Up next, we're taking some Spirit Stone red and applying it to the lenses all over our miniature. So that's the lenses around the cupola and the targeting lenses too. Next up, we're painting the headlights with Iron yellow contrast paint. Next up, we're picking out the grille on the front of those headlights with Iron Hand steel. Again here, take your time to be as neat as you possibly can and try not to hit the yellow bits. Next up, we're painting the screens in the crew compartment with Dark Angel green contrast paint. Next up, we're painting the bones and the skull inside the crew compartment with Skeleton Horde. Once we've done that, we're going to paint the purity seals underneath in the same way we did earlier in the Dreadnought part of the video. And with those details painted in, our Impulsor is battle ready. But of course there's one thing left to do on these miniatures, and that's to paint a textured base onto them to make it look like they're trudging through the war-torn battlefields of the 41st millennium. Now we're going to show you one way of painting bases. There are loads of different ways to do it, but this way is going to be really cool to make it look like cracked earth. We're going to show you how it works on this Impulsor base because it's nice and big, but this technique works on every single model in your army too. We'll start off by applying a layer of Grellan earth, a Crackle paint, all over the top of the base. Once that's dry, we're going to wash it with Agrax Earthshade to shade it down, then we'll dry brush it with Terminatus Stone before applying a layer of Steel Legion Drab onto the rim of the base. Now first of all, it's that layer of Grellan earth, and for this, because it's a large base, we're using our large base brush, but of course use the right brush for the base size you're painting. So let's grab some Grellan earth from the pot. Let's load our brush up here with quite a bit of paint. We don't need to use a palette here at all, just going to load our brush up like so. Then onto the base. Here, we're applying a nice even layer all over the top of the base, like so. When it comes to applying the Crackle paints like this, the thicker the layer, the bigger the cracks you're going to get. So apply as much as you want onto the base, it's really up to you. It's going to take about an hour for it to fully dry and get that really cool crackle effect going on. So let that dry, and once it has, we'll move on to the next stage. Of course, as you're painting this onto the base, make sure you're avoiding the parts of the model you don't want to hit. So for example, here is the clear part of the Impulsor base, or it may be a Space Marine's foot or a Dreadnought's foot. Once the Crackle paint has dried, now we're applying a layer of Agrax Earthshade over the top like this, both to shade it down and also to help seal those cracks in. Once that shade is dry, now we're applying a light dry brush of Terminatus Stone over the top to pick out that ridges and detail. Once we've done this, we'll paint the rim of the base with Steel Legion Drab. There we go, that's the base complete, and our Impulsor is battle ready. Let's see how that base looks on the other miniatures from this video as well. Here we go, our Redempted Dreadnought, he's ready to stomp into battle. And also, our Intercessor 2 is ready for glory. So there we go, that's how you can paint your Space Marines as noble Ultramarines up to battle ready standard. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Happy painting.